Unless you are an immortal jellyfish, writes Adrienne Maree Brown, death is coming for us all. Breakdown is an inevitable part of human and, in most cases, animal life. Physical breakdown, but also relational breakdown. At some point in our lives, we're all going to come into conflict with those around us. If you're part of a movement or any group of people that's trying to work together towards a shared goal, the chances of conflict go, well, through the roof. The flattening of political difference at the so-called end of history, the erosion of union membership by neoliberal policy, and the migration of our social lives online are all factors in the well-worn concept that is cancel culture. The tendency in our societies and organisations to cast out those who contravene certain unquestionable truths. Against this punitive tendency has risen up a contrarian one, a dirtbag left that gets a kick out of breaking taboos and saying the unsayable. But is there a third way? Following 3 decades of work with social movements, Brown offers us her 4th book, Loving Corrections. More practical than their previous monographs, the book oscillates between memoir, scholarship, and practical steps to course correcting those displaying harmful behaviours and beliefs. For me, the book is an antidote to those who've skim-read a single Ruth Wilson Gilmore book and have hastily concluded that abolitionism preaches that anything goes, that harm needs to be understood, not addressed, and that we should just leave everyone to their own devices. Instead, Loving Corrections suggests that we need to confront those who harm us head on, bringing them into a tight but loving bear hug, which is the building block, even the precondition for political organising. Geared towards activists but universally relevant, Loving Corrections encourages us to make ourselves vulnerable by creating change through care rather than punishment, and to understand right relationship as the sine qua non of social change. Adrienne is a doula, a facilitator, a science fiction scholar, a best-selling author, a singer-songwriter, the co-host of a sister double act podcast, and the author of a tarot deck. And frankly, I cannot imagine the state of her Google Calendar. And yet, she has found time for an hour with me. On this episode of Novara FM, me and Adrienne talk about Buddhism and why Adrienne loves desire too much to devote herself to it fully, about Israel and whether the IDF soldiers currently in Gaza are beyond the realm of loving correction, about being a military kid and more figuratively a child of US imperialism, about post-nationalism in an age of Trump, and how identity politics has poisoned our ability to be humble. Adrienne is quaking with ideas, and I'm still absorbing the aftershocks. Enjoy. Adrienne Maree Brown, welcome to Novara FM.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Rivkah.
So in 2017, you wrote this book, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Shaping Worlds, about how communities can drive social change. Then in 2019, you wrote Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good. Then in 2020, as if that wasn't enough, you wrote We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice, which, as the title suggests, is about how to compassionately address cancel culture and embrace restorative justice, or as you say, transformative justice. Why Loving Corrections? What is this book adding to your already so full of?
I really appreciate this question. You know, each book unveils itself often from the last one. Like I'll write, and then in the process of touring or talking about the book or, you know, moving through the world after a book has come out, then I can here's what people are still needing, or here's what people would like more depth, or here's another piece of the puzzle. So Emergent Strategy suggested to people that transformative justice was a path towards liberation, and that it really was particularly the way that humans do resilience, right? Is that we don't give up on each other, we don't let go of each other, and we don't rely on a state to resolve things for us. We turn towards each other and we figure it out together. We Will Not Cancel Us was in response to seeing a ton of fighting on the internet and calling each other out and doing what we were calling accountability, but looked very punitive to me. And I was really interested in how we shift from that strategy, understanding that I don't believe punishment works. So, you know, I think that it can belittle people. I think that it can make people, it's like, it feels like you're getting vengeance. It feels like something's happening, but it doesn't actually yield peace. It doesn't actually yield freedom. It doesn't actually yield connection. So if that's the case, and what we see often is when people get canceled, quote unquote canceled, they don't disappear. They don't go anywhere. They, maybe get quiet for a little while and then they come back. And I was really interested in the idea that we can use cancellation for large corporations or large governments, but when it comes to people that we have a phone number for, a relationship with, that we need to be able to reach out to them. So after that, I had a lot of people talking to me about like, what is the minutia? Like, how do you actually do that? How do you do something other than canceling people when someone has said something that's highly offensive or someone is doing something that is really harmful? And what do you do before you need to get to the place of intervention, of massive mediation? How do you handle it? And I have a ton of experience from my facilitation in doing these loving corrections. And, for about 25 years, my main work was facilitation. It was in some way holding people who were trying to create justice and liberation in the world and helping them move through things that felt impossible, differences, disagreements, different tendencies in the same room. And I was able to do it in a way that was like, I'm going to hold you accountable and I'm going to really clearly say there's a course correction that we need to make so that we can all actually move forward together. There's something that you're doing that takes us off course and we need to make this correction. And I say we need to make it because I really do feel like as long as there's one person or a small group of people who are still holding an idea that we understand to be antiquated and regressive and harmful, then that idea is in the group and the group is having to still battle and fight it out, right? So if you have one person who's still practicing patriarchy inside a group of feminists, right, you're going to be pulled to that lowest denominator of being, and you're going to have to defend against it, protect against it, navigate it, manage it. And so I was like, let me practice these loving corrections. And a lot of the writing that I was doing was embodying loving correction. So I was like, let me gather the writing together that feels like my practice of loving correction around patriarchy, around ability and disability, around how people think about the earth and class and our relationship to these things. So when I pulled it all together, I was really excited to see that this practice, I actually had quite a lot of content on the practice. And it's been really cool to have people reading the book and coming back to me and being like, these are the pieces that really helped me. These are the pieces that really stand out to me. I imagine people being able to sit down and hand this book to someone that they love who needs a loving correction and say, like, can we read this essay together and talk about it? None of the other books quite had that thing where I was like, here it is. This is what I'm saying to men. This is what I'm saying to white people. I'm trying to do a reframe with the book, which is rather than pointing at people and being like, you're bad and I'm good and that's the binary of the world, the reframe I want to make is we all get trained into these ideas that are not compatible with the future. That's how I would talk about them. There are ideas that are not compatible to coexisting on this earth together, to stewarding the land and taking care of each other. We all get trained into these ideas. I was raised to believe in a lot of these ideas that I have now come to be like, oh, that idea was antithetical to myself. So when we see people caught in those ideas, if we can understand that they're trapped in the idea and part of our work is to continuously be liberating them from those bad ideas rather than being like, you're bad, right? I think that we don't have the kind of numbers we need generally for the kind of liberation we want. So we have to bring more people out of those prisons of bad ideas and have them join us so that we can really have a tipping point on earth of people who are like, we no longer do this. We no longer operate this way. We no longer believe in a hierarchy based on skin color. We no longer do that.
It's so interesting what you talk about, that we need to be able to bring people with us on this kind of journey. And I always think about this, how we talk about ourselves as progressive, and yet on the left, often we don't allow people to progress. We see people as one thing, right. as in one place. They're either racist or they're homophobic or they're bigoted or, in some way they're wrong and we're right and we'll kind of advance into the future. And I'm interested in why you think this is, or why this has come to be, that left-wing movements are so binary in their thinking. And also, maybe this is a separate question, a bigger question, why so attached to punishment, attached to pain?
a couple of things I'll say here. One is that movement is never outside of the people that it is of, right? Movement is full of humans who are also raised in these ideas. So we're all raised inside a punitive culture. And so movement also is, right? And even though I'm often saying I want movement to be a sanctuary where we are practicing this other world, that's not necessarily how we all approach it. A lot of times we're like, I'm still acting the way I was acting when inside the patriarchal, capitalist, colonial worldview that I was raised in, but I'm trying to get freedom. And slowly we have to transform ourselves to transform the world, as my mentor, Grace Lee Boggs, said. We have to keep noticing, where are these ideas living in me and how are they showing up? So I have a lot of patience for movement because I have a lot of patience for humans, right? That I'm just like, we're all in this thing together. And I always say that movement is not better than the people, right? Movement is not, we can't think of ourselves in some hierarchy where it's like, well, I'm a good person and I'm trying to help all these bad people. That's not what's happening. I'm a person and I'm trying to be a member of my community that helps affect change. And that means I'm going to have to listen to the other people in this community and really understand who they are, where they come from, all those things. The second thing I'll say is I trained in somatics for years, which is the study of the body and its wholeness. And it really looks at like how we heal from trauma and like what's happening in our bodies. What are humans up to? And one of the key things that I learned there was that humans are always trying to protect safety, dignity, and belonging, right? Safety, dignity, and belonging. So when we join movement spaces, we're looking for those things, right? We're looking for belonging. We want some group that we can be a part of. And one of the tickets into those spaces is often being able to show that we have the same politic as everyone else, being able to show that we're like, oh, I'm not transphobic. Look how not transphobic I am. Look how not racist I am. Look how all these things. We're trying to protect that. And I think one of the things I'm trying to affect here is to say, rather than trying to belong by casting others out, we need to create a belonging that is constantly bringing others in and that is constantly pushing the door open behind us and being like, come this way. Here's the thing I just read. Let me pass it back to you. You pass it on to the next person. Don't leave people behind. And I think that the last thing I want to bring in here is I'm a big reader of Octavia Butler, and she often talked about she's a Black science fiction writer, and she often wrote about humans, like she was really interested in human nature and how we are. And she said our fatal human flaw is that we have both intelligence and a commitment to hierarchy. So we're constantly, even in movement, even in the spaces where we're trying, even in the most religious spaces, in the spaces where we're trying to just be good or whatever it is, that hierarchy is still there. We're using our intelligence to show we're a little better than others. So all of that's going on all the time. And then I think that the left is very susceptible to infiltration and to outside influences. So especially online, I say this all the time that I'm like, wow, someone came in to a conversation that I'm in, or someone's coming into the comment thread and throwing triggers left and right and getting everybody all activated. And then when I go click on that person's account, there's no there there. They've never posted anything. They have no followers. There's nothing there, right? And it's like, oh, that's a bot, or that's a troll, or that's someone who's actively trying to sow dissent inside of movement spaces. So when I'm not in online movement spaces, when I'm in offline movement spaces, that's not the energy at all. There's so much more alignment. There's so much more coherence. There's so much more respect. So part of what I think is also happening is that a lot of people are being politicized in the social media age. And for someone like me who was politicized before social media, I constantly point people back to get offline, get into real rooms with people, get onto real phone calls and actually have conversations, because people don't speak in that way when they're face to face.
Yeah. I want to touch on your history because you're kind of drawing it out already. You spent almost 3 decades as a movement facilitator. I mean, a lot of other things as well. And this book is actually part of a series on emergent strategy. And I think for a lot of people, these terms are quite jargony. They may not mean very much. So can you just, explain to people what these things are, why they've come about, and why you felt so drawn to them? Perhaps also what value these concepts can have to people outside of movement spaces.
Yeah. The term emergent strategy, the word emergence is a term from science that means the way complex systems and patterns arise out of relatively simple interactions. And I got really interested in emergence and looking at how everything in the world develops through emergent processes. Like, we are a species that has developed from being a single cell organism, right? We have developed one emergence after another. These complex systems and patterns, huge cities like London, right, exist because these small interactions, these small adaptations. And I got really curious about what it looks like inside of trying to create social change and trying to get in right relationship with the planet and other things. How do we actually use our nature, our emergent nature, as part of the Earth ecosystem to affect the kind of social changes that we want to create? And I love that it feels jargony because that means that I've been successful at getting this terminology out there. Because I'm like, when I first started talking about it, people were like, what is that? But I do think that there's a constant need to be defining what we're talking about. I think that so often we let things fly over our heads and pretend like we know and we don't, and things like that. And for me, when I was doing the writing of my first several books, I was really only thinking about the people that were alongside me, who were fighting for Black liberation, fighting for reconnecting to the earth and land back, and fighting for Indigenous people's rights. And, I was always looking at communities who were very engaged in frontline struggles, and how can my work help them be better to each other and be better with each other and be more effective in the work that we're doing in the world. Now I'm starting to raise my eyes and sort of look broader than just those who have made that commitment in movement, because we need so many more people. And I think what's happened for me too is I've recognized that so many more people are thinking about these things. There's so many people who are in their living rooms, angry, yelling at the television, scrolling on their phones, feeling dread, feeling despair. And I'm like, you are a cog in the system as long as you are just consuming the news and consuming what upsets you and just being upset and not moving that into action, right? Then you're still going along with things. And a lot of times that anger, that overwhelming feeling, that's designed to keep you from doing anything, right? It's just like, there's nothing you can do. You're too small. You're just mad. There's nothing to be done. It's too big. It's too complicated. It's out of your hands. Part of what emergent strategy says is small is all there is. Every large change that has ever happened in history has happened because a small group of people were like, something's not right, and we're going to try to make it right. We're going to get free. We're going to stop participating in a system that harms us. We're going to demand fair pay for our labor. We're going to demand that women are seen as equals. We're going to make these demands, and they're never going to be popular. When we start off making these changes, they're never popular. They always move against the power that is that is in place, whether it be kings or dictators or a duopoly, which is what I live in currently, right? So I think that if more people, this is what I'm always trying to get, more people to think of themselves as responsible for their community. You don't have to be a movement person. You don't have to be an organizer, an activist to feel responsible for your community. And once you feel responsible for your community, my hope is that the books that I've written and the books that others have written and the trainings and the organizing help others to think of themselves as leaders of the next world. We just had this massive hurricane hit in North Carolina, and the leaders that have been emerging in the aftermath of the storm have not been the state. The state's like, we're out of money. we can't really help. It's been community members who are like, okay, I'm going to take the responsibility of climbing up a mountain with oxygen tanks on my back to make sure that my neighbors who need that get care. That's not an activist act. That's just being a human taking care of community. And I think most of my ideas are ones that any human on earth could practice, and it would improve the sense of community and the capacity we all have to survive. So, I think that the ideas work for everyone. And Pleasure Activism is a book that, tons of people are like, okay, I understand how this connects to my life. I'm always trying to figure out how to also be like, okay, great. You like the pleasure part? Here's the next step.
It's a gateway drug, if you will.
It's a gateway drug, yeah. Exactly.
I was actually what you were saying about community being central to recovery from natural disasters specifically reminded me of something I edited for Novara last year by a disability activist called climate activist called Charlie Young about the wildfires in Australia and PTSD and research showing that the key thing that distinguished between people who recovered psychologically from natural disasters and people who didn't was having community and was a supportive community.
You know, one of the things I often say is community is always the answer. Like, when in doubt, find a way to do it with others. And, you know, we're in this really strange period of history where we're facing both natural and unnatural disasters that are overwhelming our systems. Oh, you know, at least in the US, you know, we have on a regular basis things falling apart, bridges falling down, like our systems are actually being blown out by the level of crisis that's happening. And I heard this terminology, polycrisis, recently that felt really helpful, where it was like, oh yeah, there's a genocide happening in Palestine and climate catastrophe is happening here. And we have an election where there's a ton of fascism on the ballot and we're facing one, you know, it's just like, and we're still in COVID. We're still in that pandemic. We're still in all these crises. They just keep layering on top of each other. So when all that layering on top of each other is happening, it can make it really hard to figure out, where do I put my attention? And again, community becomes the answer, because it's like, okay, if I'm looking at every crisis that's happening, I'm overwhelmed. If I bring my attention down to like, does my neighbor need my support? Does someone here in my community that I can walk to or drive to need my support? Do I need their support? Then it becomes easy to figure out, like, I just have to figure out the next step of being responsible in my community, right? You know, if all of us do that, or if enough of us do that, there's a way through.
I was rethinking the meaning of the book's title, Loving Corrections, because I think originally I had understood it as loving corrections as opposed to sort of hateful corrections or punitive corrections, or the way that the US justice system understands corrections, which is literally the prison system. But now that you're talking, it also makes me think of when you were talking about how easy it is now to absorb the poly crisis in such a passive way. Loving corrections also implies the opposite of like a passive involvement or engagement. And loving really involves making yourself available to others and vulnerable to others in ways that I think are quite antithetical to the way that we live our lives now. Like, we like to think of ourselves as like separate individuals that don't have responsibilities to other people, maybe particularly acutely in the US, at least from my very limited experience.
I was going to say, I think the US and the West, right? Like, I feel like the more capitalism is working for your country, the harder it is to avoid the individualism that comes along with it. So in the US, in order to survive, you have to be in a constant state of competing with others. You have to be in a constant state of scrambling for resources. And so it becomes very hard to think as a community member. And it becomes very hard to figure out what's your responsibility inside of that. And yeah, I think you understand the loving corrections piece. You know, it is all those things, right? Because there is one part of it, which is, most people don't respond positively to a correction when someone's just yelling at them or screaming at them or denying their humanity and being like, you need to change, right? Relationship is the core of a loving correction. Loving corrections are like, we're going to course correct the shape of our whole relationship. We're going to say, I don't want to be in my head thinking badly about you or thinking, wow, you're so far behind, or you keep hurting my feelings. I want to bring it out. I want to let it come through my mouth and say, give you a chance to change. Give us a chance to change. Give us a chance to do something together. And it takes time. Loving corrections don't usually happen like overnight. Relationship allows the changes to happen over time, and it allows them to be multi-directional. I'm not supposed to be just fixing and changing some other human, right? I'm like, I'm growing and you're growing. And sometimes you're going to be the one who helps me see myself more clearly. And sometimes I'm going to be the one who helps you.
The reciprocity thing that you just were talking about there really reminds me of something that you devote quite a bit of time to in the book, which is reflecting on your attitude towards COVID-19, anti-vaxxers, perhaps anti-maskers in the US. And I'm just interested in whether this book is written as a loving correction to yourself in a way.
Well, I think most of the pieces include some aspect of loving correction to myself, right? Most of the pieces are like, I grew up in a patriarchal world. I unlearned it. And here's my dear men, love note. But it's like, I had to first have that moment with myself and my own internalized patriarchy. So yeah, I think each one is. I think on COVID-19, that's one of the places where I was like, oh, like I was so terrified in the early days of the pandemic. And, I'm still regularly like, this is such an overwhelming thing to be just ongoing and living with. But it made it really hard for me to understand that there was another position or that there could be a legitimacy to those other positions. And with time, I was able to rethink it, right? Which is like not necessarily providing like, here's the solution. Structurally, we don't have a great solution in which people can be against vaccines or against masks and still be part of protecting their community for COVID-19. Like we're in a bind, right? That we shouldn't be in, right? That if our governments all came together and we're like, we're actually going to have everyone stay home for a month, we would be done with COVID-19. Like that's still the case. There'd be long COVID that people are surviving, but we wouldn't still be in this active transmission state. And the fact that we are, so often what I'm trying to get people to do is like turn their attention to the folks who are actually creating the problem. Most of the time, it's not the person you're yelling at. We're both victims, or we're both further down in the power chain than the person who's actually making these decisions. And what we want to do is figure out how to get side by side and turn and face this common problem. Why are we facing this issue? Why are we in this problem? Why are we in this situation? And even for the people who are upholding these systems, how do we get them out of those systems? How do we make the system dysfunctional or not possible? It's like it can't function because no one will participate in it. That's always my dream scenario for these messed up ideas, is that like everybody's like, oh my God, I would never be a white supremacist like that. I would never do it. And there's no system that supports it. And I could never get a job if I was a white supremacist, and I could never live if I believed that white people were superior, right? I'm like, that's to me, the cultural success of the organizing we're doing is to get to a place where it's like, oh, we look back at the dark ages and we're just like, oh my gosh, like we don't just put leeches on people. We don't just cut open their brains and drain them. Like there's so much stuff that we can look back and be like, clearly that was not a good idea. I think now we're living in a set of things like that where it's like, we need to get to a place where it's like, clearly that's not a good idea. But we need to be together to do that. And I think the systems are working when we're turning against each other.
Do you think there's also a sense that perhaps identity politics, and particularly the liberal form of identity politics, which was a term originally created by the Combahee River Collective to enable better organising, but has been turned against us, is disabling that kind of humility that is necessary for reciprocal loving corrections, because people think that their moral virtue derives from their subject position. So, for example, we see this very clearly in Gaza, where Jewish people, having experienced a genocide, feel that their actions are morally virtuous because of their experiences, rather than because of what they're actually doing in the present.
Yeah, one of the Black feminists that I love, Barbara Smith, she has this quote that says, they ran with the identity and dropped the politics, right? So I don't think the issue is around identity politics in the sense that there is a politic to the identities that we're born into that are often quite valid. It's like, to be a Black, queer, disabled person, it does have certain implications. But if I only glom onto the identity aspect of it, and I'm just like, because of these identities, I don't have to be accountable, or I get a special centering in every conversation, then I think we find ourselves in trouble, because it means that we're not actually able to tune into like, what is happening in this situation. And yeah, I love that you brought up the situation in Gaza, because I think so much of what's happening globally is that folks are like, well, if you're Jewish, you can't be doing bad things. Like that could never happen, because something so bad happened to Jewish people that they would never do that again. So even if we can see that that's what's happening, we literally can't click in our minds that like that's possible, right? And that there's this separation that happens. I often get really curious about the places where an idea gets glommed onto a people, right? So I'm like, oh, Zionism and Judaism and Jewishness are not the same thing, but they've been sutured together. And part of the work of this past year, I think for many, many years, I think for tons of people who have been figuring out what being an anti-Zionist looks like, especially Jewish people who are figuring that out, has been pulling the things apart, pulling these pieces apart and being like, Zionism is this idea, and even the idea is understood differently by different people. So when I say I'm an anti-Zionist, the Zionism I'm talking about is the idea that there could be a place where only one people get to have power, one people get to have decision-making, one people get to take everything from other people. The same way I am critical of the U.S., where I'm like, they didn't call it Zionism. It was just colonization when it was happening here in the U.S. And probably that's not how they were talking about it either. They had their own language for their time. But the action is the same action. And the action is the thing we have to be like, if anyone is doing that action, we have to hold them accountable. We have to stop that action. And we have to come up with the conventions and the rules, yes, but it doesn't matter if we don't actually enforce them and say, this is not a way forward. The politic of what's happening is the important thing to pay attention to. And I'm really moved and have been deeply moved by how the solidarity between Palestinians and anti-Zionist Jewish people has grown over this past year. I'm really moved by the bravery of anti-Zionist Jewish action, because I'm like, oh, that to me, that is identity politic, right? Being like, we are taking our identity as Jewish people, as people who have lineage that survived the Holocaust. We're taking that identity and we're applying it politically to help our Palestinian brothers and sisters who are being harmed in our name. We say no, right? To me, that's identity politic at its best.
And there's a key difference in that anti-Zionist Jews like me don't claim to speak for all Jewish people, and that we're saying specifically that we're trying to dismantle the idea of monolithic Jewish politics or politic.
Exactly, because there is no monolithic thing, right? In the same way, there's no monolithic Palestinian thing, right? Like part of how Israel is doing what it's doing right now is to be like, every Palestinian is Hamas, and we're going to exterminate every Palestinian, instead of looking at, oh, the history of Palestine is that there's been many, many bodies of leadership. Many of them have been disrupted, destabilized, made impossible. Hamas has emerged, but Hamas emerged in the 80s, like Palestine, this struggle has been going on so much longer than that. So that would mean that Palestinians had something before Hamas, have something other than Hamas. There's multiple ways of doing it. Whatever you feel about Hamas, all Palestinians just are not that, in the same way that everyone in the U.S. doesn't belong to the army, right? Like every place has a multitude of people trying to do a multitude of things. I think this has also been one of the ways that we can respond to like the pink washing. Like when I first started stepping up for Palestine, people are like, well, if you're a queer person, you'd be killed over there. And I'm like, right, because you don't think that there's queer people in Palestine. You don't think that there's queer Arabs. Like you don't think that there's queer people everywhere. Like, and I live in a country where being queer is still dangerous. Like on any given day, our rights are being revoked. Like I live in a place where trans people's rights are being revoked. So there's something interesting to me, right, about having this moral superiority that keeps us from being able to see the truth of what's actually playing out. And that's what we always want to tune into, is like, let's drop under all the language. What's actually happening? Who is it happening to? How do we make sure that they're safe? How do we make sure that we're safe? Okay.
Now that we're onto the subject of Israel, I want to ask you what I feel is quite a challenging question, and one that I've actually been kind of playing out aloud on my own social media recently. The other day on Twitter, I tweeted that perhaps rather than mocking traumatized Israeli soldiers returning from Gaza, we should understand them as the victims of a genocidal project that eats its supposed beneficiaries from the inside, and use that knowledge to create a coalition that includes Israelis. Now,
how did that go?
Not well.
I was about to say Rivkah.
I knew it wouldn't. Yeah. I knew it wouldn't go well. I think I wanted to try and push the discourse about who loving corrections extend to, and maybe at this point in time they don't extend to Israelis. But I wanted your thoughts on that. And are there people for whom loving corrections shouldn't be offered at a given point in time, cannot be offered? Are there people beyond the scope of this book, effectively?
I think that there are people who are in a state of crisis themselves. So I would say that if you are an IDF soldier right now who's going into Gaza and driving tanks over humans or rounding up humans and children, and you've gone to that state in your humanity, I think you're in a crisis position where there's going to have to be work done before a loving correction should have happened a long time before you get to that place. From that place, there has to be a de-traumatizing process before you can sit in a conversation, I think, at all. And part of that is you have to be disarmed, right? That's one of the biggest things I keep talking about now is like if someone is on a killing spree, you have to stop the killing spree before you can even begin a conversation. You can't be like, hey, let me stand next to you while you keep shooting people and try to have a meaningful, deep, loving, connected conversation. Like literally in loving corrections, I talk about this all the time. You're trying to sit and hold the hand of someone as you have this struggle with them. So if a loving correction doesn't happen and we find ourselves in these escalated places, then we have to make other moves. And I think those other moves, there's still course corrections on the scale of history. Now, I will say that doesn't mean we don't still extend love, right? That we don't still extend love to everyone that we can extend love to. And we find ways to do that. And for me, one of the ways I have been doing that with Israel over the past year is to think of it the same way I think of the US, right? That I'm like, this is a place where the story that people have been told is so compelling that it is almost impossible for us to see ourselves clearly. The story that Israelis have been told about what it means to live in Israel, and the story that a lot of people, diasporic Jewish people have been told about what Israel is so compelling and so propagandized and so total, right? That it's like, this is our safety. This is the living embodiment of our safety. That story becomes much bigger than anything else is happening. And the fact that everyone serves in the military is huge, right? So the kind of propaganda you have to be in order to have every single person in your society go spend 2 years at least in the military force. So it's not like in the US, you can say, look, I don't agree with what the US military is doing. I never served and I don't support it and whatever, right? You can't say that in Israel. If you're a grown up in Israel, then that means you're like, I somehow participated in that, right? Very few people don't. So it makes for a very complicated space, right? In this time, I think that there are Israelis trying to make those loving corrections inside of Israel. I see the marches. I've seen people trying to stand up against their government, and I can see what's happening to them. It's very difficult. And the same thing here. It's like people are standing up, doing the encampments, trying to speak out, and it's all getting shut down. It's all getting barreled over and ignored. The scale of loving correction right now, for me, is not at the level of the individual soldier, but it's at the level of nation. So the rest of the globe has to gather and lovingly course correct the US and Israel, right? And it has to say, y'all have to stop, because I don't see it as two entities. It's like we're doing this thing together. We're in this project together. And there are groups here in the US and probably where you live as well of people who fought in the war in Iraq. They're now veterans against war. Iraq veterans against the war, right? Folks who have served. I've talked with Maytal, I can't remember their last name right now, but Maytal, who wrote a book about being an IOF soldier and then the aftermath, like recognizing what they had been involved in and the healing journey they've had to take. But it takes a long time. It takes years. And the book is called Bloodlines. It's a beautiful text because I don't think that there's any human who I want to take outside of the possibility of recovery in their lifetime. But I don't think it happens spontaneously necessarily. And when folks are in a place where they're like, I'm killing and it's not bothering me, or I'm killing and I feel celebratory, I feel like a victory, I'm experiencing it as a video game. I'm like, pew, 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 I'm taking out. I'm like, that is a crisis for a human soul to be in that place. They're in a level of crisis that's beyond what a loving correction could attend to, right? They need a different level, right? So for what I mean by it, right, where I'm like, it's not going to happen in one conversation and it's not going to happen. It still does need to be, I'm trying to think of the way to say this, because for me, as long as we coexist on earth with people, we have to believe that they can change, right? We have to believe it just for our own survival. Like, it's like, we will not survive if all these people can never change and they just tear the world apart. So as an organizer, I have to constantly believe and reconvince myself, because sometimes I lose touch with it. I have to reconvince myself that even those people who are doing the most egregious harm can recover. And we do have examples of that. We look at South Africa, we look at Rwanda, we look at Bosnia, we look at places where genocide has happened and people live. We look at Germany, right? We look at places where genocide has happened and then there was a next day. And then there was a day after that. And then there was a day after that. And then slowly people made meaning of what have I done? How did we get there? And how do we have that never happen again? I think one of the things we're recognizing in this moment in human history, we said never again, but we didn't create a culture of never again, right? We said never again, but we kept a culture of hyper-militarization and saying that only hyper-militarization keeps us safe. Only guns keep us safe. Only weapons keep us safe. Only dominance keeps us safe. That and never again can't go together. They can't coexist. You know, I really believe that we have to set down the arms. We have to set down that colonial mindset. And I think decolonization is a long journey. And I do think decolonization is a loving correction. Maybe it's a both and kind of answer. But in terms of what you said of like, how do we welcome these soldiers who are just coming out of Gaza? I'm like, they have to first decide that they want to be done with the killing. They have to decide that they want to be done with that domination as a path for their own humanity and their own lives. And we can be a lighthouse, right? In the dark, we can be a lighthouse. It's like, you don't have to keep doing that. I say that all the time, you know, here, like I say that to people all the time. I'm like, just because you did it today, you don't have to do it tomorrow. You don't have to keep doing that. You can set this path of violence and destruction down at any time, and you can begin another path. Right now, it's so important that we stop the murdering that is happening, that we stop the mass murdering. I mean, like, I don't know about you, but like we're watching death marches happen. We're watching mass extermination activities. I can't spend my time right now sitting down with a soldier and being in that process. We have to stop the whole system. We have to be a wrench in the gears of the system. After that is stopped, then we do need folks who are willing to go and be like, okay, you lost it. Mm-hmm, we have to help you find it again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting, though, because this is where the emergent strategy kind of gets flipped on its head, where most of what you're talking about is how we build loving, corrective and healing relationships in order to build kind of structural change. What you're saying in the case of Israel is that actually we might need structural change. We might need an arms boycott, an arms embargo on Israel to kind of forcibly disarm Israel, because I'm not sure, and I don't think you would say that soldiers in Israel are all going to collectively be persuaded to put down their arms. And then on that, just to finish that thought, is that, like, you know, we need the structural change to happen before we can even enter into relationships with these people.
Yeah, well, I think it's a little bit different than that. So for me, it's like we're building the relationships from this end to get that structural change to happen. Do you see what I'm saying? So like boycott, divest, and sanction has been doing what felt small, but it's been a small and growing movement to get people to divest. That is a really long-lasting strategy that's taken a lot of organizing to affect structural change, right? Right now, we're doing the organizing that the students are involved in, and we're talking to people, and we did this ceasefire resolutions all over the place. Like, structural change requires lots of small relational activities, lots of conversations. So we're building those relationships with those we can actually touch and who are not going to shoot us as we come towards them to say something, right? I feel like then that structural change can stop them from driving off the cliff and driving everyone else off the cliff. Then we can attend to what's happening with them. And I think that that's the case. You know, I think if you think about it, like, I always try to make something smaller to understand it. So I'm like, literally, if you have one person who's throwing a tantrum and who is harming and reaching out and acting out to everyone, first you have to make sure that that person is contained, that they're not actually hurting anyone else. Then you can begin to address, okay, now what do we do about the people that you've hurt? Now what do we do about you?
I totally understand what you mean now. And that it does come from the bottom up, but the bottom up is not the coalition with soldiers; it's the coalition with people who are against the genocide.
Yes, and it's also creating a space for those soldiers to go, right? Because I do think the Iraq Veterans Against the War, they are self-organizing. They are people who, they know what the U.S. did in Iraq. They can't live with it. They find other people who are like, I also can't live with it, and they are some of the most powerful voices to speak out against war. I think in Israel, hopefully one day that'll be a lot of these IOF soldiers, right? That's a vision, right? But it'll be hopefully post occupation. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, there's got to be that big, something has to shift. And I think that's the thing where you look at folks. I'm glad that there's so much stuff that's been coming out around like what Nazi Germany was actually like on the ground, and like how people went through their days, and how many people were not like thinking of themselves as part of a genocidal project. And I think that as wild as it is to try to stretch my mind to imagine that that's happening in Israel, that there are people there who are like, they do not see what they're doing for what it is, right? I also know that that has to be the case, that there are people there who do not understand what they're doing. They think that they are defending themselves, truly think that. And however they got into that worldview, first they have to be stopped from causing all the harm. And then some of that deprogramming has to happen, because I think of myself as a deprogrammed person to the point that I now identify as post-nationalist from being a patriot. I was raised with a military father, and I was like, yes, go US, go dad. Like, this is awesome. I've come all the way to like, I don't think that the US as a nation state can be made functional as a whole project, not without truth and reconciliation and really attending to the wounds of genocide that are in our soil, the wounds of slavery that are in our soil, the wounds of colonization and capitalism that are in our soil. I don't see how we recover from that. I think you can see us spinning out now and having, to horrific effect. So that's deprogramming. But what it has given me is a deep relationship to the land and a deep relationship to other people, and recognizing like, oh, the state is actually not what makes or breaks my life. Like, my life is made by the people I'm in relationship with and in relationship to. And none of them are my enemies. None of them are my enemies. Even people who have stupid flags on their yard. Like, if I run into them in the hardware store, we're not enemies. Like, we're both getting nails, So learning to be a neighbor.
I would love to have a whole hour-long another conversation with you about your upbringing as a US military kid and, time in Germany and stuff. And I mean, there's a fantastic chapter that I really point everyone to sort of fast forward to in the book with your sisters, where you have this really interesting moderated conversation, which I find so wonderful and a real example of the loving corrections that you talk about. But I wanted to talk about something else, given that we don't have much time, which is Buddhism. So I'm a Buddhist. I'm a Buddhist. I am part of a Buddhist community in London. And I'm just speculating, but it feels like Buddhism has had quite an influence on you. I don't know whether you have a Buddhist practice. You talk about Thich Nhat Hanh's death moving you deeply. Buddhist suttas appear explicitly in the afterword of the book. You talk about right relationship, which really echoes with, the Eightfold Path. And just even the philosophy of the book, this idea of, having responsibility for each other really feels like it resonates with Buddhist ideas of no fixed and separate self, the idea that we're all fundamentally part of one being, and also, your commitment to abolitionism probably, I'm sure, and clearly does, from what you say explicitly, come from abolitionist thinkers, and you've just been described explicitly as an abolitionist. You describe yourself, I should say, but those ideas also seem quite Buddhist to me, and maybe I'm just projecting, but ideas of conditioned existence that you yourself say we need to stop projecting ideals onto people, and rather than hold people to ideals, quote, we invite honest assessments of where and how they are and what is needed to move forward. And that just seems so Buddhist to me. Can you just talk to me about Buddhism and what effect it's had on your work?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I feel like many of the teachers of the kind of human I want to be have been Buddhist teachers. My practice, I have a meditation practice that has been really useful to me. And there's been different times when I took on, I tend to be a collage spiritualist, right? So I tend to sort of be like, oh, I like this and I like that, maybe I'm a Buddhist gospel person or something, like, I want more pleasure and desire than the average Buddhism space makes room for, right? I think that the body and what we can feel in the body is the place where I often diverge from Buddhist space, where it's like not being attached to desire. I'm like, oh, I feel actually fundamentally attached to desire, fundamentally attached to my body, fundamentally attached to the relationships I'm in. And I like that. Like, I viscerally want to be of the world and heart pounding and pulsing. I just want to feel this body. It feels very important to me. So that said, in almost every other way, I very much identify as Buddhist aligned. And like I said, Thich Nhat Hanh is someone who I looked up to while he was alive. I have read a ton of his text, and I have felt called accountable to. And I feel like on my best days, those are Buddhist days, right? Where I'm like, okay, like I'm not being reactive. I'm really taking the time to let this thing settle. I also feel strong influence of Taoism. And I think especially in emergent strategy, the Tao Te Ching plays a big role in shaping that. And so I feel like in that collage, I dance between those spaces a lot. And I generally am not a big joiner of spaces or practices. So I'll float, like I'll be like in a meditation group for a while, but mostly I'm a very big hermit. I'm much more introverted, I think, than most people know. So but yes, and I think would be my big answer there. And I read a ton of Buddhist texts, which I find really grounding and helpful. One of the things that helps me the most is this idea that since the beginning of time, we've had these kind of problems. We've had these kind of issues where humans are generating conflict and going to war with each other. And throughout all of those times, there have been people who have been meditating and who have been turning towards each other and who have been seeking nobility, seeking dignity with each other. And there have been people who understood that we are all interconnected, that we are one thing growing and learning and changing together. That gives me hope, that like, okay, like in this time, all this chaos is happening, all this polycrisis is happening, and I need to be as deeply rooted as possible. And I need to make sure I return to the mat every day and sit there and meditate. And I need to make sure that, this right relationship piece feels so important to me that I'm like, I have a lifetime to figure out how to be in right relationship with the earth and everything on it, but I only have a lifetime, and it's trying to hold that both and at all times of like urgency, and there's nowhere to rush to. Even in this moment, we're in election season in the US, and what happens often is it gets this fever pitch energy. Everything is intense, urgent, trying to take deep breaths in that moment and be like, okay, we only have the amount of power we have right now. We only have the capacity we have right now. Our job is to use it. And that to me feels like a Buddhist approach to moving through election stress and election panic.
Yeah. Well, I would definitely agree that the best days are Buddhist days. But it's really fascinating to hear the interplay of all the different ideas in your work.
Yeah. And then, the afterword is written by Janine de Novais, who's my best friend, and she has an incredible Buddhist practice. And she's outstanding. I mean, some of our chats are like me being like, can you just teach me Buddhism? Like, because every time she explains something to me, it makes more sense than almost anyone else who teaches it to me. And it flows through her work as well. Like she has a book called Brave Community that I'm always telling people, like, this is how to talk about race. Get this book. This is how it's done. And I think it's very grounded in Buddhist practice.
I'll finish. We've only got a couple of minutes, so I encourage you to be brief. But the US election, it would be impossible to end without mentioning that. The US election is right around the corner. You've said yourself you may or may not offer an endorsement. I don't think you have yet, or you're not going to.
No, you know what I chose to do was a little different than that. I was panicking about the election, and so I reached out to a bunch of organizers who I trust who are on the ground right now, and I did a series of conversations, and conversations were really, really helpful. I talked to folks who, some of them are, were like gung-ho, blue or nothing, blue or bust, and some people revolutionary socialist. And there were patterns that emerged in the conversation, one of which was really decentering the elections, being like, election is only part of it. And it really is the least of the things that we can do. But the strategy is to block and build, or to defend and build, to figure out how can we use this election to defend the most vulnerable communities we can while building the left, because the left here is clearly weak, or we would have been able to stop the funding that we're sending to Palestine. Like, we have all these leverages, right? And I haven't made an endorsement because I'm a person, but I have uplifted the endorsements of the organizations that I have interviewed. So the Working Families Party, the Carolina Federation, the North Star Socialist Organization, various organizations that were part of the series of conversations I've had. I've been really shocked at how aligned they've been. This block and build strategy basically every single person came back with some variation on that. Very few people are excited about being a part of this election, but it does feel like, especially down ballot, like getting people to focus their energy not just on what's happening at the very top, but bringing that attention down ballot, doing education about Project 2025. So for me, I'm like, I understand that there are people who can't vote for Kamala and just can't find a way to vote for this current administration, given what has happened in Palestine. I deeply understand it. And there's still all these down ballot places where MAGA is encroaching, where fascism is encroaching, where Project 2025 is encroaching. So a lot of it has been, if you can't figure out what to do at the top of the ballot, just go down ballot. There's so many other options. And for people who are voting third party, it's like they're trying to get their 5% so that we can actually bust up the duopoly. I see that strategy. It's not my strategy, right? The one that makes the most sense to me is figuring out, of the people who can actually contend for the White House right now, who do we move towards, or who do we move our people towards? So that block and build strategy has made the most sense to me. But I was part of the uncommitted movement, and it felt really important to me to be able to hold the space of like, you don't get an endorsement when you behave this way, for me.
And voters have a certain leverage that they can use. But yeah, I think this is such a difficult election for you guys. And I think that, like you said, these are not necessarily two parties that we can offer loving corrections to. We offer loving corrections to each other to figure out
how we navigate.
Yeah, exactly. And which is the terrain, the Kamala terrain or the Trump terrain, that we are going to be able to operate on more effectively.
Yeah. And like right now, we're living on the Trump terrain already. The Supreme Court got totally screwed by the time that he was in office. And so we've lost our right to abortion, and we've lost other things. And so that terrain question becomes a really interesting and important one. I also love the idea, because I don't know how people think about voting there, but here it's like, it can be very personal. Folks are like, this is my value, and I'm looking for like the person who I love and who's my best friend and who like shares everything with me. And that so many of the people who came on to talk with me were like, that's not what voting is. Voting is choosing your opposition. It's choosing your target. It's choosing who you plan to organize and who you think is organizable. And I do think that we have seen Kamala be organizable within the constraints of the campaign, in terms of what she has said about Palestine, what she has said about genocide. But it's deep to me that we, and I think it's humbling from a movement perspective to say, we don't have the leverage we need to have to force her to say arms embargo, right? We don't have the leverage we need to get the ceasefire. We don't have the leverage we need. So to me, that's on us, right? Who we have to choose from, that is a function of the organizing we do. And so that's why that build the left piece feels the most important. And that's why I'm like, whatever you're choosing to vote for, I'm not going to let go of you because I'm trying to build the left. So if you think a different strategy than I think is the best one, go for it. I'm still going to hold your hand. And the next day we're going to go to work.
Well, I'll let you get to work then. You've got less than 2 weeks to single-handedly solve the US election. But thank you so much.
Thank you, love. I appreciate that. And thank you for this conversation, Rivkah.
Yeah, it's been so rich. And I encourage all of you to check out not just Adrienne's book, but also their Instagram, where, as you say, you've been doing these election sessions and having fascinating conversations with people. You're very, you unlike many of us, you utilize social media very, very well. So yeah, thank you so much for doing so much.
Thank you very much. I try to do that. And I also, all of the conversations, the audio of them is in the podcast feed for my podcast that I do with my sister called How to Survive the End of the World. So if you're like, I'm not going to sit on Instagram and watch a conversation for an hour, then that's fine. You can listen to the podcast version of it.
Right, exactly. Having a sister double act podcast, just wow, that's also just the cherry on the cake. But yeah, Adrienne, thank you so much for being on NovaraFM. We appreciate your time.